modernism, however, established rules were breakable. Writers and many readers accepted poems and stories in shorter bursts, segments that did not obviously flow from one to the other. Rather than a unified oil painting, a modernist work was more like a mosaic composed of individual pieces. It required the viewer to organize the pieces into a meaningful picture. The rise of popular culture, last heading on page 697. The paperback revolution was both a cause and an effect of growing democratization in the 20th century. Beginning in the mid-1930s, books began to be available as paperbacks, which were cheap and portable. This made more literature available to more people more easily. It also led to the merging of literary works and popular works into one larger cultural stream. Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan Adventures, Zane Grey's best-selling westerns, Dashiell Hammett's mysteries, Americans ate them up. Radio also made electronic storytelling enormously popular. Many families never missed an episode of The Shadow or Superman. Movies, too, began to tell stories in more and more spectacular ways. For some, movies even began to replace literature. Let's jump over to page 698. The American Experience Contemporary Connection, William Faulkner, Hollywood script doctor. William Faulkner's legacy as a Nobel Prize-winning literary giant certainly outshines his lesser-known role as a Hollywood screenwriter. It was a need for money, not a love of the movies, that drew Faulkner to Hollywood in 1932. In April of that year, he signed a 6-week contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and began writing a screen adaptation of his own story, Turnabout. Faulkner quickly learned about making artistic concessions. MGM had him write a new character into the film to showcase Joan Crawford, one of their major stars. For the next 13 years, Faulkner would work intermittently writing screenplays for various studios. Faulkner did not believe that his screenplays were worthy of any special admiration. However, during his stints in Hollywood, he earned screen credit on films, both major and minor, including To Have and Have Not, 1944, The Big Sleep, 1946, and Gunnaden in 1939. Though Faulkner once said, quote, "Hollywood is a place where a man can get stabbed in the back while climbing a ladder," end quote, he did have alliances there. Howard Hawks, one of the foremost directors of the time, was a friend and an ally. Faulkner associated with some actors as well and stood up for them, saying, quote, "I know very few actors, but the ones with whom I did come in contact were normal, hardworking people leading much saner lives than we are led to believe," end quote. The next question from your textbook is on 699. What makes American literature American? And then the next question, what changes in literary elements contributed to American modernism? Let's look under the title Narrative Conventions. Modernist storytellers paid close attention to how they told their stories. They often left out transitions between events and omitted the detailed expositions and explanations that readers found in older literature. Sometimes they left plot lines unresolved, refusing to tie up every thread. Readers had to interpret on their own. Modernists shifted time in their stories, moving among past, present, and future. They also shifted between inner and outer realities, influenced by developments in psychology, particularly those of Sigmund Freud and William James. Modernist writers wove characters, dreams, and fantasies into their narratives. They tried to create the natural flow of thoughts, memories, and insights, the quote-unquote stream of consciousness connected only by associations. That term, stream of consciousness, is one I recommend that you put in your notes. We'll come back to it when we talk T.S. Eliot. Let's look at forms for a moment. Modernists also broke formal boundaries. Two European giants led the way. Irish writer James Joyce's Ulysses in 1922, many consider the most important novel of the 20th century, revolutionized the novel with multi-layered chapters based on Homer's Odyssey, and French writer Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, 1913 to 1927, recaptured his own past in 7 free-flowing volumes. Modernists invented new structures, some expansive and encompassing, others compressed. At the small end of the scale, imagist poets, including Ezra Pound and Hilda Doolittle, created miniatures of hard, clear expression in concrete images. Themes. Most often, works of fiction, poetry, and drama have implied themes. In modernist works, themes are even more indirect. Readers of modern literature need to pay closer attention, ask more questions, and forge more connections for themselves. In addition, the challenging theme of the nature of art itself often dominated the modernist imagination. Tone. An overall tone of irony marks many modernist works. Writers such as Eliot, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Faulkner were painfully aware of the gap between the world as it was and the world as it ought to have been. Again, just to point out on 699, those essential vocabulary words, consciousness, indirect, and breadth. Let's keep going on 700. They were not satirists mocking the world in order to improve it. They were ironists dissecting the world simply to make it possible to live in it. Style. In prose, journalism brought a news style into fiction. Most obvious in Hemingway, American style strove for shorter, harder-edged sentences, snappier dialogue, less flowery descriptions, and everyday American vocabulary gave modern American works a recognizable style. In poetry, free verse enabled such poets as Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams, and E. E. Cummings to create new rhythms of variety and surprise. Imagery. High culture and low, domestic and exotic, elegant and vulgar, common and bizarre, and everything in between. The 20th century opened the biggest box of images that writers had ever had. For Ezra Pound, a crowd in a subway could be blossoms on a tree. For S. Scott Fitzgerald, a pair of eyes painted on a billboard could watch a tragedy unfold. For Langston Hughes, a dream could explode. Modernists saw the world with new eyes and helped their readers see it newly too. Allusion. Now this is an important word. A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N. Write it in your notes. This is not illusion. I-L-L-U-S-I-O-N. Allusion is what a magician does, right? When he makes an elephant disappear. An allusion is a reference to a literary text. The range of possible allusions, references to other texts, grew wider too. T.S. Eliot quoted the Indian Upanishads. Ezra Pound quoted Latin and ancient Greek. Hemingway referred to African tribal customs. Marion Moore invoked both baseball and ballistics. The reader's familiarity was no longer assumed or even required. The end result was a world-embracing awareness in American literature, a breadth of vision that still amazes us today. Look at the next question on page 700. How did the relationship between writers and the public change during the Modernist period? Modernism began an overall distancing of serious writers from the general reading public. With the rise of mass communication and popular culture, modernist works were sometimes seen as obscure or elitist. There was no doubt that they made greater demands on readers than romantic or realistic works. More mental and imaginative effort was required to read Eliot's The Wasteland or Stevens' Harmonium than to read the fireside poets like Longfellow. As a result, some of the literary audience turned away. Many writers believe that great literary works teach their readers how to read them. In this sense, modernist writers also became teachers. In time, people learned how to read modernist works, how to make the connections, fill in the blanks, listen to new rhythms, and appreciate new images. Modernism gave people new ways to be delighted, and many modernist devices are now taken for granted in the 21st century. By 1945, another question. By 1945, what identities had emerged in American literature? During the Modernist period, the American profile included these varied identities and character types. 1. Denizen of the wasteland. Denizen just means a person who lives. A denizen of the wasteland. A wanderer through a war-wearied landscape, spiritually exhausted in search of new values, defined by T.S. Eliot. Another one, member of the lost generation, disillusioned, self-indulgent, escapist, expatriated, embodied by Fitzgerald and Hemingway. Another one, triumphant commoner, believer in the innate strength of those who remain close to the land, led by Faulkner, Welty, and Steinbeck. Poetic maker, believer in the saving power of art and imagination, championed by Pound, Stevens, Williams, Cummings, Moore, and Frost. African-American artist, creator of art drawn from the African-American experience, represented by Hughes, McKay, Cullen, and Hurston. You also have on 701 there a little box called The American Experience Developing American English. Let's read that one real quickly. Sliding with Slang by Richard Lerter. Slang is hot, and slang is cool. Slang is nifty, and slang is wicked. Slang is the bee's knees and the cat's meow. Slang is far out, fresh, fly, and fat. Slang is awesome, copacetic, and totally tubular. Slang is the spice of language. It has added its spice to American literature as American writers, particularly in the modern age, have increasingly written in an American voice, using the words and rhythms of everyday American discourse. Listen to the poet Langston Hughes. Good morning, Daddy. Ain't you heard the boogie-woogie rumble of a dream deferred? Defining the lingo. The Dictionary of American Slang defines slang as, quote, the body of words and expressions frequently used by an intelligible or rather large portion of the general American public, but not accepted as good formal usage by the majority. Right? If you've ever been, for example, corrected for the use of the word ain't, right? In other words, it's vagabond language that prowls the outskirts of respectable speech, yet few of us can get along without it. What's in this name? The word slang may have developed from an erroneous past tense, sling, slang, slung, or from thieves' language or beggars' language. Jargon and slang originate with a particular group, but slang gets slung around by the whole population. In fact, slang may now make up a fifth of the American wordscape. Let's finish on page 702, 703. Tim O'Brien's observation about literature as a magic carpet. O'Brien was born in Minnesota, as you can read on 702. He was drafted after college to fight in the Vietnam War. Although he's written extensively about the war and its aftermath, he resists being labeled a Vietnam writer. O'Brien's fiction explores the larger themes of betrayal and loss of faith, as well as the tension between truth and fiction. He has been called the best American writer of his generation. Let's hear what he has to say. Read along with me on 702. As a boy of 15 or 16, feeling restless and marooned in a small town on the prairies of southern Minnesota, I began using literature as a kind of magic carpet, a way of flying off to more exciting places on the earth, a way of escaping the brutal Minnesota winters and the dull, drowsy summertime fields of soybeans and alfalfa and corn. Sounds familiar for a few students who have grown up in Worland, right? I didn't merely read, I was transported. I lived inside stories and novels. Just turn a page, that simple, and I was suddenly a soldier in World War I, or a young man in love during the famous Jazz Age, or a grieving parent, or an aging railroad engineer, or an old African-American woman trudging down a path through the frozen woods of Mississippi, inventing stories of my own. The word literature, I'll confess, did not mean much to me. It seemed too fancy, too formidable. Even so, by the time I graduated from high school, I had read mostly on my own, mostly for fun, a good many of the stories and poems that appear in this unit. I remember, for instance, my first encounter with Hemingway's in another country during the summer between my sophomore and junior years. I remember marveling at the water-clear transparency of the prose, the deceptive simplicity of the plot, the quiet, uncomplaining dignity of the characters, those solid nouns, those invigorating verbs, the unspoken and unspeakable emotional pain that hovered like an invisible vapor just above the surface of each page. More than anything, though, I remember thinking, wow, I want to try this. I want to invent stories of my own. I want to write fiction someday. The next topic, poetry as explosive as artillery. Not much later, in the first months of my junior year in high school, these fantasies about becoming a writer were reinforced by the work of two very dissimilar poets, T.S. Eliot and Robert Frost, both of whom are represented in this unit. Until then, I'd stupidly conceived of poetry as something for English teachers and nearsighted librarians. I hadn't realized that a good poem could be as explosive as any artillery round, as powerful as any rocket lifting off for the moon. The next heading, Living the Poem. From T.S. Eliot, I learned that vivid writing requires vivid imagery, and that vivid imagery requires something unexpected and off-the-beaten literary path, a patient etherized upon a table, sawdust restaurants, women who come and go talking of Michelangelo. Lines, by the way, from Love Song of G. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. To this day, Robert Frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening remains one of my favorite pieces of writing. The words in themselves are ordinary, no need for a dictionary, but the impact of the poem, its pressure on the human spirit, is extraordinary. We feel the cold, snowy dark against our skin. We hear the harness bells, the wind, and the eerie, timeless echo of our own mortality. We don't merely read the poem, we live it. And we come to understand that one way or another, all of us have promises to keep and miles to go before we sleep. Rekindling a fire. My dream of becoming a writer has come true, and yet rereading these stories and poems has rekindled a fire inside me. I'm a teenager again. I want to write a new novel. Well, there you go. An introduction now to the modernist age. We'll turn and we will study a number now of the titles, beginning with the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, T.S. Eliot's classic. Thank you.